The morning Gideon Fry drove his good buggy up my road to court Della. I was 41 years old, and too proud and too stupid to know that I had already let the best part of my life keep my house for 3 years, without once telling her so. I stood in the barn door with a halter rope in my hand and watched that buggy come, the lacquer on it catching the early sun, the horse stepping high and groomed, and something in my chest went cold and tight, the way a man feels whether coming before there's a cloud in the sky. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself a lot of things in those days, and not one of them was the truth. You have to understand what I was then. I was a man with the door shut. 3 years before that morning, I had buried my wife, Anna, in the little fenced plot on the rise above Quartz Creek, under the one cottonwood that held its leaves longest in the fall, and after I filled the grave I went down to the house and I shut a door inside myself and I did not open it. I worked. That was all I knew how to do. I ran my cattle up the green draws of the Bellwether Valley in summer and pushed them down to the home meadows before the snow. And I rose before the light and I came in after it, and I let the work be the wall between me and the grief, and I called that living. But a ranch with 2 small children on it cannot be run by a man who has shut the door. I had Toby, who was 6 the spring his mother died, all elbows and questions, and I had Pearl, who was 3, and did not yet understand that her mother was not coming back from town. For a month after the funeral I tried to do it alone, and I made a poor, stumbling ruin of it. I burned the bread and I could not braid Pearl's hair, and Toby took to sleeping in the barn because the house had gone so quiet and so cold. I was drowning, and too proud to say it, and I might have gone right on drowning and taken those children under with me if Della had not come. Della was Anna's younger sister. She'd married a steady young man named Sam Cope 2 valleys over, and they'd had a baby girl. And then in the bad winter the year before Anna died, a fever came through their settlement and took Sam and took the baby both inside of a single week, and left Della a widow at 24 with an empty house and an empty cradle, and nothing to do with the love she'd had stored up for them. When word reached her that her sister was gone and her sister's husband was foundering, she packed one trunk and she came. She came on the stage to Bellwether, and she walked the last 6 miles up the creek road carrying that trunk by its handle, switching it hand to hand, and she came up onto my porch with the dust of the road on her hem, and she looked at the state of my kitchen and the state of my children and the state of me, and she set the trunk down and she said, "Well, I'll stay till you're on your feet." She never left. That was 3 years before Gideon Fry's buggy. And in all that time she never once said she was staying for good, and I never once asked her to, and that, I have come to understand, was the great cowardice of my life. I won't pretend those 3 years were anything but the saving of us. The morning after Della came, the bread was right and Pearl's hair was braided in 2 neat plates, and Toby came in from the barn for breakfast because the house smelled like a house again. Della took the place and she set it to rights, not the way you'd set a stranger's place to rights, all stiff and apologetic, but the way you'd set right a thing that was partly your own. She'd grown up alongside Anna. She knew this country. She knew the work of a frontier woman down to her bones, and she did it with a quiet, unhurried steadiness that made you trust the ground under your feet. She kept the garden and the milk cows. She made the butter and the soft white cheese, and she carried the surplus to town and sold it to the mercantile and the boarding house, and the money from it was her own. She kept it in a tin behind the flour, and she bought what she pleased with it, cloth and books for the children, and once a fine pair of laced boots for herself, and I never said a word about it because it was hers and we both knew it. She had her own room off the kitchen, with a curtain she'd hung and a row of her own things on the sill, and she had her own standing and her own counsel, and she gave it to me plain when I needed it and held it back when I didn't, which is a rarer gift than people credit. And she loved my children. That is the part I cannot put rightly into words even now. She loved Toby and Pearl with the whole of that stored-up love she'd had no place to put, loved them the way a woman loves children who have lost a mother and need one so badly it makes your heart crack to watch it. She was their aunt by blood. But inside that house, she was their mother in every way the word means except the one that's spoken in a church. Pearl could not remember Anna. Anna was a face in the one tintype on the mantel. To Pearl, the warm hands and the bedtime voice and the cool palm against a fevered forehead all belonged to Della, and she called her Aunt Della only because we all did. But I have heard that child, asleep and dreaming, call out Mama, and it was Della who got up in the dark and went to her. So you see what I had. I had a woman of quiet strength and real worth keeping my house and raising my children and standing as the warm center of the only home those two had ever known. And I had 3 years to look at her every single day across the supper table in the lamplight. And I want to tell you the truth of it. I loved her. I had loved her, I think, for longer than I would ever have admitted. I loved the steady way she moved through a room, and the way she'd push a loose piece of hair off her face with the back of her wrist when her hands were floury, and the low laugh she had that I heard too seldom, and the way she'd stand on the porch in the evening looking out at the dark mountains as if she were listening to something. I loved her, and I never said it, and here is the rotten little reason I told myself, the reason I hid behind for 3 years like a coward behind a wall. I told myself it would dishonor the dead. I told myself that to love Anna's own sister in Anna's own house in the very years of mourning was a low and grasping thing, that the country would talk, that I'd be a man who couldn't even keep faith with his wife's grave before he reached for her sister. And there was just enough truth in it to make a good hiding place, for that is how the best lies work. But under that, if I'd had the courage to dig, I'd have found the real thing. I was afraid. I had loved a woman once and watched her die, and the loving of her had nearly killed me when she was gone. The door I'd shut so I would never have to feel that again. And as long as I never said a word to Della, as long as I let her go on being Anna's sister, come to help, I never had to risk the door. She was simply there, like the creek and the mountains, a permanence I had stopped seeing because I saw it every day. I took her for granted the way you take for granted the air. And I would have gone right on doing it until we were both old, I think, if Gideon Fry had not come up my road that morning in his lacquered buggy and made me understand, in one cold rush, that nothing is permanent that you have not had the courage to claim. I knew Gideon, of course. Everybody in the Bellwether Valley knew Gideon Fry. He owned the freight line that hauled goods up from the railhead, and he had a half interest in the mercantile, and he was a widower of about my own age. A sober, decent, prosperous man who'd lost his own wife some years back and had no children, and who was, by every account, exactly as good as he seemed. That was the worst of it. If he'd been a scoundrel, I could have run him off and felt righteous about it. But Gideon Fry was a kind man and an honest one, and he had met Della at the mercantile over her butter and eggs across those 3 years, and he had come, that morning in his good clothes, to court her properly, in the open, the way a respectful man courts a respectable widow. He climbed down from the buggy and he took off his hat and he asked me, square and courteous, if Mrs. Cope was at home and might receive a caller. I stood there with the halter rope in my hand like a fool. Everything in me wanted to say she's not, she's busy. There's no Mrs. Cope here for you, but I had no right to any of those words because I had never once claimed the right. And Gideon was watching me with those calm, decent eyes, and so I heard my own voice say, stiff as a fence post, I expect she's in the house. And I watched him put his hat back on and walk up to my porch and knock on my door, and I watched Della come out drying her hands on her apron, and I saw her face when she saw him, surprised, and then pleased. A soft, startled pleasure that I had not put there and could not have, and that look went into me like a knife. He courted her in the parlor for an hour with the door open and proper, and I stood in the barn pretending to mend tack that did not need mending, and when he drove away he tipped his hat to me too, the decent so-and-so, and Della stood on the porch a moment watching the buggy go, and then she went back inside to her bread. At supper she said nothing of it. She set the table and fed the children and asked Toby about the calf he was nursing along, and the lamplight was warm and ordinary, and only I sat there with the cold weather still in my chest, knowing that the ground I'd thought was solid had a crack running right through the middle of it. He came back the next week and the week after. He was not a man to rush a thing, Gideon, and that was the worst part. There was nothing to take offense at, nothing to push against. He brought small, sensible gifts a respectable woman could accept without scandal. A paper of good needles, a tin of orange marmalade all the way from England, a book of poems with a green cover. He sat in my parlor and talked low and easy, and he was good with the children too, which galled me past bearing. He taught Toby a card trick, and he carved Pearl a little horse out of a pine knot, a clumsy, kindly little horse, and Pearl loved it and carried it in her apron pocket, and every time I saw that little wooden horse I wanted to throw it in the creek. I, who had carved that child nothing in 3 years. I, who could not even braid her hair. And Della, I have to tell this part honestly, because Della was no helpless thing being moved about like a checker on a board, and I will not have her remembered as one. Della knew her own mind better than any soul I ever met. She received Gideon Fry because Gideon Fry was a good man offering her, plainly and honestly, a real and good life, a fine house in town, a settled and respected place, a husband who would say out loud the words a husband ought to say. She was a widow of 27 who had lost a husband and a baby, and given 3 years of her one life to her dead sister's family without a single promise made to her in return, and she had every right under heaven to weigh a good man's honest offer. She did not toy with Gideon. She did not toy with me. She simply, for the first time in 3 years, let herself be asked, and watched, I think, with that quiet steadiness of hers, to see whether the man whose house she'd kept and whose children she'd raised would say anything at all. I said nothing. God help me, I said nothing. I had 100 chances and I let every one of them go by. There was an evening she stood on the porch in the cool after a hot day, looking out at the mountains the way she did, and I came and stood near her, close enough that I could have spoken, and she said, soft, not looking at me, "It's a fine valley, this. I never did get tired of these mountains." And I knew the way you know a thing in your blood, that she was giving me a door, that all I had to do was say one true word, say, Della, don't go, say stay. This is your home and you are its heart, and I cannot do it without you. Say even the smallest piece of the truth. And I stood there with my jaw locked and my heart hammering and my 3 years of cowardice sitting on my chest like a stone, and I said, "Looks like good weather holding." And she stood a moment longer, and then she breathed out slow, and she said, "Yes, good weather," and she went inside, and I heard the door of her little room close, and I stood on that porch and called myself every name a man can call himself, and still I did not go and knock and make it right. The children felt it before I'd have credited them to. Children always do. They live close to the ground where the weather is. Toby went quiet and watchful and started picking fights with the rooster and once with a boy in town. And Pearl, who was 6 now and sharp as a tack under all that softness, took to following Della from room to room with the little wooden horse clutched in her fist, and one night I heard her ask, in that piercing clear voice children have, "Aunt Della, are you going to marry Mr. Fry and go live in the town?" And there was a silence in the kitchen that went on too long, and then I heard Della say, careful and gentle, "Hush now, pet, eat your supper," which is not no. I lay awake half that night because it was not no. It came to a head at the end of the summer, the way these things do, all at once after building slow. Gideon Fry drove out one Sunday in the full heat of August, and this time when he asked for Mrs. Cope, he did not go into the parlor. He and Della walked out instead, slow, along the creek under the cottonwoods, and they were gone the better part of an hour, and I stood at the corral fence and watched the willows where they disappeared and ground my teeth to powder. When they came back his face was solemn and hopeful both, and hers was composed in a way I'd learned to read as Della holding something carefully, and he tipped his hat to me, the decent everlasting so-and-so, and he drove away. And Della came to the fence where I stood, and she folded her arms on the top rail beside mine, not touching, and she looked out at the cattle a while, and then she told me. "Gideon's asked me to marry him, Asa," she said, plain the way she said everything. "He's a good man. He's offered me a good life." She paused, and I could hear her choosing the words. I told him I'd give him my answer at the harvest dance, 3 weeks. She let that sit. The cattle moved in the heat shimmer and a fly buzzed at the rail. I think, she said, slower now, and there was something underneath it, something I was too dull and too scared to reach for. I think it's likely time I had a place of my own again. The children are growing. Toby hardly needs minding. You've long since got your feet under you. She turned her head and looked at me then, full on, and her eyes were steady, but there was a question burning all the way at the back of them, the same question I'd been refusing to hear for 3 years. Don't you think, Asa, she said, very quiet, that it's time? And there it was, the widest door she ever opened. All I had to do was walk through it. I could feel the words pressing up in my throat, the true ones, the 3 years of them. No, don't go, you can't go, this is your home, you are this home, I love you. I have loved you so long I forgot how to say it, I am only afraid, that's all it ever was, I'm just afraid. I felt them rise up. And then I felt the old door slam down inside me, the one I'd shut on Anna's grave, the one that had kept me safe and kept me dead for 3 years. And instead of the truth I heard my own voice come out flat and cold and ruinous. I expect a woman ought to do what's best for her. I will carry the look that crossed her face to my own grave. It was not anger. It would have been easier if it were anger. It was a kind of sad, final settling, the look of a person who has asked a question one last time and gotten her answer and put a thing away inside her for good. The light in the back of her eyes, the question, the hope, the burning thing, it just went out quiet like a lamp turned down. Yes, she said, I expect that's so. And she pushed off the rail and she went up to the house, and that evening she got down her trunk from the loft, the same one she'd carried up the creek road 3 years before, and she set it open at the foot of her bed, and I watched her, through the kitchen door, fold one of her dresses into it, slow and smoothing it flat with her hands, and I understood that I had done it. I had let her go. I had stood in front of the only door that mattered and I had nailed it shut myself. The 3 weeks before that harvest dance were the longest and the worst of my life, and I will not stretch them out here. The house went wrong in the way it had gone wrong after Anna died, only quieter, because this time nobody was sick and nobody had died. It was just the slow draining out of the heart of the place while we all pretended it wasn't happening. Della went on with the work, faithful to the last, the bread and the butter and the children's clothes mended and laid by, but a little at a time she began to lift herself out of us. She'd put a thing in the trunk. She'd take the children, one at a time, on her knee in the evening, and tell them she'd always be near. That town was only 6 miles, that they could come for cake on Sundays. And they'd listen with big, solemn, frightened eyes, and I'd sit in the corner with my newspaper held up in front of a face that wasn't reading a word of it, a coward to the bone. Toby quit fighting and went hollow instead, which was worse, and Pearl stopped carrying the little wooden horse. I noticed it one evening. The empty apron pocket, and I asked her where her horse had got to, trying to be easy about it, and she looked up at me with that clear, hard child's gaze, and she said, I gave it back to Mr. Fry. I don't want to go live in the town. And then she said the thing that I have thought about every day since, the thing a 6-year-old child saw plain as daylight that her grown fool of a father could not see at all. She said, Pa, if you don't want Aunt Della to go away, why don't you just keep her? And I had no answer. I had not one single answer for my own little girl. I said something, I don't even know what, some grown-up nothing, hush now, it's not so simple, pet. And she looked at me the way children look at you when they've caught you in a lie and they're too kind or too young to name it. And she climbed down off my knee and went to bed. And I sat there alone in the lamplight in my emptying house, and I thought about that word, keep, as if a person were a thing you kept. And then I thought, no, that's the coward's word again, that's the word that lets you off. You don't keep her. You ask her. You stand up like a man and you tell her the truth and you ask her and you give her the right to say no and you live with whatever she says, but you say the true thing first. And I understood, sitting there, that the not saying had never once protected anybody. It hadn't protected the dead. Anna, of all souls, would have been the first to take me by the ear and march me into that kitchen. Anna had loved her sister better than anyone alive. It hadn't protected me. It had only kept me in a half-life, and it surely hadn't protected those two children upstairs, who were about to lose the second mother of their short lives because their father could not open his mouth. The silence had never been honor. It had only ever been fear wearing honor's coat. But I want you to understand, I'm a slow and stubborn man, and even then, even having seen it whole and plain, I might have funked it. A man can see the truth and still lack the nerve to walk into the cold and stand under it. It is one thing to know what you ought to do at midnight in your own kitchen, and another to do it in the lamplight of a dance hall in front of the whole valley, with a good man standing there who had every right to her, and had never been a coward about it for one single day. I'd like to tell you I rode in there sure. I wasn't sure. I was sick to my stomach, but I went, and I'll tell you why I went, and it wasn't my own courage. It was Pearl's. The harvest dance was held that year, as it was held every year, in the big timber-floored hall above the Mercantile in Bellwether, with the lanterns hung in the rafters and the long tables of food, and the fiddler up on his box, and the whole valley turned out in its Sunday best. The harvest in and the first frost on the way, and everybody glad to be warm and together one more night before the snow. We drove in, all four of us, in my own plain wagon, and it was the strangest, heaviest ride of my life, because we both knew, Della and I, sitting up on that seat with the children behind us. We both knew that she meant to give Gideon Fry her answer that night in that hall, and that the answer by every plain sign was going to be yes. She had on her good dress, the dark blue one, and she'd done her hair careful, and she sat straight and quiet beside me, and the 6 miles went by in a silence you could have leaned on. I tied up the team and we went up the stairs into the light and the noise and the warmth, and it closed over us, and we were swept apart in it the way you are at any gathering. Toby off to the knot of boys, Pearl clinging to Della's skirt a while and then drawn away by the other little girls toward the cake table, and Della into the company of the women, and I to the wall by the door where the men stood who didn't dance, and I watched. I watched Gideon Fry, sober and handsome in his good dark coat, cross the room to Della and bow over her hand, and I watched her smile up at him, and I watched the two of them step out together when the fiddler struck up. A slow turning dance, and they moved well together, the prosperous good man and the steady worthy woman, and anybody looking would have said, there's a fine match, there's a couple meant to be. Anybody but the fool by the door whose own heart was being carried away across that floor in another man's arms, while he stood and let it happen. I do not know how long I stood there. Long enough to drink a cup of cider I don't remember drinking. Long enough to watch them dance twice. Long enough to see Gideon lean down and say something low and serious to her near the end of the second dance, and to see her go still, and to understand that he had asked her for her answer, right then, and that the moment had come, and that I had run clean out of weeks and days and was now down to minutes, and that I was going to stand here by this wall and lose her, and that it would be no one's doing but my own. And then Pearl came across the floor to me. She came weaving between the dancers in her little Sunday dress with the hem already coming down on one side, and she had a look on her face I'd never seen there, fierce and frightened and out of patience all at once, a look she'd plainly gotten from her aunt and maybe from her dead mother before that, and she took hold of my hand in both of her small hot ones, and she pulled hard, the way a child pulls when they have decided something and will not be put off. "Pa," she said, and her voice cut right through the fiddle and the stamping feet, clear and high. "Pa, you have to come now. You have to come tell her. Mr. Fry is asking her, and she's going to say yes, and then she's going to go away to the town forever, and you have to come right now and tell her to stay and be our mama for real." And her eyes filled up and spilled over, and she stamped her little foot on the timber floor, and she said it again, the whole of it, the thing I had not had the courage to say in 3 years, said by a 6-year-old child in front of God and the valley. Tell her to stay and be our mama for real. And every excuse I had ever made fell off me at once, like a coat I'd been wearing in the heat. There was no door left to shut. There was just my little girl crying and pulling at my hand, and across the room the woman I loved standing still with another man's question hanging in the air over her, and the whole of my cowardice laid bare in front of everybody, and the simple, terrible, freeing fact that there was nothing left to be afraid of, because the worst thing had already started happening, and only the truth could stop it. So I let that child pull me out onto the floor. I let her tow me right through the dancers, who slowed and turned to look, the fiddle scraping down to nothing, the whole hall going quiet and curious the way a crowd does, and I crossed that floor with my daughter's hand in mine, and I stopped in front of Della and Gideon Fry, and I took off my hat, because that's what you do when you finally come to say a true thing, and I looked at her. Della was looking at me with her face gone pale and her eyes very wide and dark, and Gideon was looking at me too, and I saw in his face, that good, decent man, that he already knew, that he'd known longer than I had, maybe, and was only waiting to see whether I had it in me. And I found, when I opened my mouth, that the 3 years of words did not come out in a flood the way I'd feared. They came out slow and plain in the only voice I had, a hard man's worn-out honest voice, there in the lantern light with half the valley listening. "Della," I said, "I've been a coward for 3 years, and I've let you stand in my house and raise my children and hold the whole of my life together, and I never once told you what you are to me because I was afraid. That's the truth of it. Not honor, not Anna, just afraid." I had to stop and get my breath. My hands were shaking on the hat brim. I told myself loving you would shame the dead. But Anna loved you better than anybody on this earth, and there's not a thing she'd have wanted more than for you to be happy, and for these children to have you. The shame was never in the loving. The shame was in the silence. The shame was letting a good man like Gideon Fry have to be the one with the nerve to say out loud what I've felt every day for 3 years and swallowed every time. I heard a sound go through the hall, soft, the women, but I didn't look away from her face. "I don't have what he's offering," I said. "I can't give you a fine house in town nor a settled, easy life. I've got a hard ranch up a creek and 2 children who already love you and a man in front of you who's slow and stubborn and just about too late. But I love you, Della. I have loved you longer than I knew how to say it. And I'm not asking you to stay and keep my house. I'm not asking you to do what's best for the children, though God knows you're the best thing that ever came to them. I'm asking you for yourself, free and clear, with everybody here to witness it. I'm asking you to marry me. Not because we need you. Because I want you, and I should have said so the day you carried that trunk up my road, and I'm saying it now, and you can answer me however you will, and I'll honor it. But I had to say the true thing first. I owed you that 3 years ago." And then I shut my mouth and stood there, hat in my hands, with my heart laid open in front of the whole Bellwether Valley, having finally, far too late, and at the worst possible moment, opened the door. For a long moment nobody moved. The fiddler held his bow still. Pearl had gone quiet and was looking up between us with her whole soul in her face. And then Gideon Fry, and I will speak well of that man to the end of my days, Gideon Fry stepped back. He took 1 step back from Della, and he gave her a small bow, grave and gentle, and then he turned to me, and he put out his hand, and when I took it his grip was firm and there was no bitterness in it at all. "I always thought it was you, Ward," he said low, "just for the 2 of us. I asked her honest because she deserved honest, and because a woman like that ought to be asked plainly by somebody, and you weren't doing it." A ghost of a kind smile. "I'm glad you finally did." And he let go my hand, and he stepped away into the crowd, and he gave Della 1 more bow, and that good man took himself off to the cider table and left the floor to us, and I have never in my life respected anyone more. And then there was only Della standing in front of me with the lantern light on her face, and the question now hers to answer, free and clear, the way it should always have been. She did not answer it quick. That was Della. She looked at me a long, long moment, and I saw the years go across her face, the trunk on the creek road, the burned bread set right, the braided hair, the porch in the evening, the door I'd shut in her face at the corral fence 3 weeks before. I'd hurt her. I knew I'd hurt her, and I knew she was a woman of too much sense and too much pride to just fall into my arms because I'd finally found my tongue. She had a choice to make, A real one between a kind, sure man who'd never made her wait and a slow, stubborn one who'd made her wait 3 years and only spoke at the very edge of losing her. I stood and let her make it. It was hers to make. I'd taken that long to learn even that much. Then Pearl, between us, could not bear the silence 1 second more, and she tugged Della's skirt and said, in a small wet whisper that the whole quiet hall heard, "Please, Aunt Della, stay and be our mama for real." And Della looked down at that child and her own eyes filled, and she put her hand on Pearl's head, and then she looked back up at me, and she let out a breath that seemed to carry 3 years on it, and the light came back into the back of her eyes, the warm burning thing I'd watched go out at the corral fence. It came back. "Asa Ward," she said, and her voice was not quite steady, "you are the slowest, stubbornest, most aggravating man in this whole valley, and you very near let me go for the sake of your pride." She stopped and her mouth trembled toward a smile. "But I have loved this place and these children, and heaven help me, you, for longer than you've had the sense to say it back. I gave 3 years of my life to this family, and I did not give them grudging. I gave them because I wanted to. I have always wanted to." The tears went over and ran down, and she didn't wipe them. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you fool. Of course it's yes. It was always going to be yes if you'd only ever once asked." I do not rightly remember the next little while. I remember the hall coming apart in noise around us, the women crying and laughing and the men stamping and the fiddler suddenly sawing out something fast and glad. And I remember Toby pushing through the crowd to throw himself against the both of us, and Pearl crowing and dancing on the timber floor. And I remember most of all that I had Della's 2 hands in mine at last. The floury, butter-churning, child-braiding, work-roughened, beloved hands I'd watched for 3 years and never once held. And I held them then in front of everybody, and I did not let go. We were married 3 weeks later by the circuit preacher, in the little church in Bellwether, in the first week of true frost, with Toby standing up straight and proud beside me and Pearl scattering the last of the asters down the aisle, and Gideon Fry in the 3rd pew, who came of his own accord and shook my hand again after and kissed the bride's cheek like a brother, and went home a bachelor and a gentleman. And that night we drove the 6 miles back up the Quartz Creek Road in the cold starlight, the 4 of us in the wagon, the children asleep against the seat back under a buffalo robe, and Della sat up beside me with her shoulder against mine, my wife now, by her own free choosing and not by anybody's need. And she looked out at the dark mountains she'd never tired of, and she said, soft, "It's a fine valley, this." And this time I had the sense and the nerve and the open door to say the true thing. "It is," I said, "and you're the heart of it, you always were. I just took a fool's 3 years to say so." That was a long time ago now. The children are grown and gone to places of their own. Toby to a spread of his own up the valley, and Pearl married to a good man down at the railhead. And they bring their own little ones up the creek road in the summer to a house that has been full and warm now for more years than it was ever empty. Della's hair has gone gray at the temples, and so has what's left of mine, and we sit out on that porch in the evening still, the 2 of us, and she watches the mountains and I watch her, and I have learned in the back half of a life to say the things a man ought to say while there's somebody there to hear them. I'll tell you the lesson of it, since I paid so dear for it, and a man ought to leave something useful behind. I spent 3 years believing my silence was a kind of faithfulness, that to say nothing was to keep something safe, the dead, the children, my own poor heart. But silence never kept a single thing safe. It only kept it from me. The home I'd thought I was protecting by saying nothing was the very home I almost lost by saying nothing. And it took an honest man's courtship, and a child's playing crying to teach a grown fool that the thing you love is not yours because it stays near you. It is yours only when you have had the courage to stand up in the light and claim it, and give it the freedom to choose you back. I waited so long I nearly threw it all away. But she chose me anyway, free and clear, and gave me back the door I'd shut, and let me build, out of 3 swallowed years, the family that had been standing in my own kitchen the whole time, waiting on me to find my voice. I found it at last, late in front of everybody with my hat in my hands and my little girl pulling me across a dance floor, but I found it, and I have not let it go silent since.